Hi, good afternoon from London today. My name is Bernice Lee. A big warm welcome to this briefing at Chatham House, what happened at COP27. I should start by apologizing that I'm actually a little bit under the weather, which means that I'm not only going to be slow and probably going to be very slow on picking up cues from the wonderful panel that we've had here, I'm also going to murder their names. I can absolutely be sure of that. But more important, of course, is the fact that as we dry off the sea, water, and the sand in our hair from Sharm el-Sheikh from just last weekend, we have a chance to think through some of the implications, what happened in Sharm and what are the implications as well. I mean, this is a year of weaponized energy dependence, especially fossil energy dependence. This is a year of lived climate impacts. This is a year where lived climate impacts and in some ways, weaponized fossil dependencies come together in many ways, as we see some of the results of which. And given the year that we have, as I like to try to be definitely glass half full, if not glass half full and glass half empty at the same time. We sort of certainly, I certainly feel that given the year that we've had, it isn't a case of backsliding, which in itself is quite an important development. Now, today on the panel, I'm going to sort of introduce them as I go along, because as I go along my introduction, this event is on the record. It is being recorded. It'll be available as well later on. Now, please do start asking questions in the Q&A box as we go along. We will start the question in earnest in about sort of half an hour's time after each of the panelists, who will no doubt be much more disciplined than I am right now doing, which is sticking to their 4 minutes time. Now, what is coming out of all the dead headlines out of Sharm is very clear that it's historic, because we have now got a loss and damage fund, which is why the first person who will kick us off will be Anna Aubrey, who will be kicking us off in a second about the significance of that. Now, there are obviously still a lot of questions as well around extent to which the mitigation agenda, the bit where we can in fact limit the impact, for example, things like the liability around the loss and damage facility, etc., where the agenda is going. And that is both a question of the mitigation agenda as well as the question around the fossil phase out, phase down question. That no doubt there have been many different headlines around those as well, that Gleda Lan is going to take us through after Anna Aubrey talked about the loss and damage. There are obviously also some of the sort of new stuff as well, that there's not all as in addition to loss and damage facility, there are other new stuff involves nature-based solutions and food systems, which Thiago Kaneshiro Mihara will take us through as well. After and also some of the issues around climate justice as well, I understand. Now, following that, another news thing that I know that is a yawning thing when we talk about the 100 billion, this open wound international system. At the same time, what we have seen as well in terms of achievements or some of the new stuff is really about language for the first time in the UNFCCC context around the reform of the international financing institution, and that's what Lilia is going to take us through as well after that around the climate finance and the IFI reform agenda. But last but certainly not least, there are obviously, when it comes to implementation, we now are quite aware that we are moving into a different kind of COP 20 years on from the beginning of the process. We talk about implementation, and some of the key actors that may or may not be as present as they could be, and Karim El-Gendi is going to, El-Gendi, in fact, as I said, I'm murdering their names, which I will continue to do so throughout the day, and please forgive me, will take us through and also help us as well look forward to what may or may not be expected in the UAE as well in COP28. So now, without further ado, I wonder, Anna, whether you would like to kick us off as well with the agenda around loss and damage and adaptation as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bernice, and good morning to everybody dialing in. On loss and damage, it is really remarkable how much the discussion and the positions of developed countries have shifted just since COP26 in Glasgow. The agreement to establish this loss and damage fund is historic, and it will undoubtedly be one of COP27's major legacies. It is something that climate vulnerable developing countries have pushed for decades, and it has recently joined up the G77 and China, so this big block of developing countries who have jointly called for this establishment as well. Developed countries generally have not wanted a fund. They have preferred to work through existing institutions to see how these can be strengthened to better respond to loss and damage. And these diverging positions were clear going into COP. During the first few days, we saw developing countries come forward with a very strong call to establish a loss and damage fund at COP27. While richer nations initially said they preferred setting up a process to identify appropriate solutions with an outcome at a later stage, most favored 2024. But over the course of the conference, we did see a softening in language from several developed countries. And the real breakthrough really came on the Thursday evening, what was supposed to be the penultimate day of COP27, where the EU took the floor saying that they would support a loss and damage fund if it were targeted at the most vulnerable countries and open to receiving support from a broad range of sources and donors. A link was also made to making progress on the mitigation agenda. The negotiations and the discussions continued over the next few days, and in the end, there was this agreement to set up a dedicated fund at COP27 as part of broader funding arrangements for loss and damage. But as Bernice mentioned, critical questions remain to be fleshed out. These include which countries will be eligible to receive support from this fund, how will it work, what type of activities will it fund, and most importantly, who will contribute to it financially. These details will be discussed over the next year, and the aim is to make decisions on the matter at COP28. And we will see how this goes. Not least the discussions about who will pay are likely to be very tricky. Richer countries want the base of donors contributing climate finance to be broadened beyond those countries that were considered developed in 1992. So essentially, this means that big emerging economies like China, for instance, and oil-producing states like Saudi Arabia should also contribute with funding. And this question about broadening the donor base is very relevant in the discussions about loss and damage, but it extends to the wider discussions on climate finance as well. So that's really a key sticking point going forward. The agreement on the fund is, of course, what everybody's focusing on, and it is very, and it has the highest kind of symbolic value. But I think it's important to mention also that there are other elements in this loss and damage decision which could be equally or perhaps even more important when it comes to scaling up loss and damage finance. There is, for instance, a call or an invitation for the UN Secretary General to convene the principles of the international financial institutions and other relevant organizations in order to identify how finance for loss and damage could be scaled up. There's also an invitation for the international financial institutions to consider how they could strengthen their response to loss and damage at the IMF and World Bank spring meetings in 2023. I'm sure Lilia will say a bit more about this later on. And this is important because we do need a package of solutions responding to loss and damage, even when this fund is up and running, and even if it does receive a lot of contributions from various sources. It's unlikely that it will be a kind of a silver bullet to the loss and to solve the loss and damage challenge. And what I think was very important at COP27 is that loss and damage finance is now on everybody's radar, and I think there is a genuine sense of urgency and a willingness to find solutions in this space. Finally, a few words on adaptation. I think it's fair to say that this topic received a lot less attention than loss and damage, and that many would have wanted to see stronger outcomes. Some of the things that were agreed was that there was a decision to launch a process for developing a framework on the global goal on adaptation. There were also some pledges to the adaptation fund, and there was a request for the Standing Committee on Finance to prepare a report on the commitment to double adaptation finance, which would be considered at COP28. Yeah, lots of speakers after me. I only had 4 minutes, so I think I'll leave there, but very happy to answer questions and discuss more in the Q&A segment.
Brilliant, right on time as well. And also you have already, I started a list of things that are in the long grass of COP28 that Anna has already started piling up in terms of to be resolved. So we can pick up on those as well later on. Next, but certainly not least, Gleda Lam, why don't you pick it up from here, Gleda?
Thanks very much, Bernice. Can everyone hear me okay? I was a bit worried about my Wi-Fi. Okay, thank you. So yes, the UNFCCC says that we're on track for 2.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise over pre-industrial temperatures by the end of the century. And the Paris Agreement says that we really need to keep as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. Now, the interesting thing is we haven't gone, the world hasn't gone above the 1.5 over that average in 12,000 years of farming civilization in human society. And it's even over the whole of human evolution, it tended to oscillate between -6 and +2. So it's something completely new and unknown. So just wanted to emphasize that to begin with. So in 2015, you had the 194 countries committing to keeping global temperatures well below 2 degrees, with 1.5 being the ambition. And Glasgow kept that goal alive last year. So did the outcome on COP27 make any progress on Glasgow? Most would say not from the text. It keeps alive the 1.5 ambition. It cites the need for rapid, deep and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, reducing them by 43% by 2030 relative to a 2019 level, which is around about what the IPCC recommends. But it doesn't really say how. And if you think about the time frame that we have, really, 7-8 years to do that, people really wanted to see much deeper and stronger language in that final text. Leaders did agree that the Glasgow Climate Pact would guide a new mitigation work programme, which would start immediately after COP27, which would aim to get the parties to align their targets and actions towards net zero and do much more on implementation. Of course, next year is the stock take when the countries will be looking at what has been achieved on mitigation. That is in the UAE. Next year. But I would say that all the drama in the text was on fossil fuels. The text mentioned last year in Glasgow that the need for accelerated efforts to phase down unabated coal, which is basically coal-fired power. But coal was mentioned for the first time, and it also emphasized getting rid of an inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. A lot of people argued with the language because it's quite weak, but it was new, it was momentous in the sense that these were mentioned for the first time this year. There was great interest from many countries in including these to include all fossil fuels, that there should be a phase down or a phase out of all fossil fuels in the text. India actually led that call and asked to see a phase down of all fossil fuels. It was supported by a large coalition of countries in the end, included the US, the EU, the UK, although they were strong that they didn't want that language to weaken the resolve on coal. And just if we just think about how important this is, how important it is to have fossil fuels in the text, producing and burning coal accounts for about 30% of all annual greenhouse gas emissions. Oil and gas accounts for about 40%. So if leaders are agreeing on the deep and rapid emission cuts in the next 8 years to include the phase out or phase down, to include fossil fuels seems beyond logical argument. Nevertheless, it didn't get in the end. I think it's interesting that there was stronger than usual oil and gas industry presence at the COP this year, and there were a lot of meetings dedicated to decarbonisation, so how far technology could go to keep oil and gas in the system, but to use technologies like carbon capture and storage and methane emissions reduction technologies and using of gas in power. So in the end, you had about 80 countries or more than 80 countries calling for fossil fuels to be included in the text, but interestingly, it didn't. And we don't really know the exact discussions that took place around that. But there were a coalition of high ambition countries, which right at the end on the Saturday held a press conference calling for emissions to peak by 2025 and to put the world on the path for phasing out all fossil fuels. That was the language they used. That coalition included UK, Norway, OPEC member Gabon and Colombia. And then you have, together with that and alongside that, you have a huge initiative from the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance members led by Denmark to try to make sure that fossil fuels is included. So there's a lot going on in those final hours, but somehow it didn't get into the text, largely thought to be due to the pushback from Saudi Arabia and inaction from the COP president, Egypt. So that's where I'll end. And having said all that, as you can see, it was dramatic, it was interesting, and I think that leaves a lot of room for further deliberations and diplomacy ahead of COP28 to strengthen that text.
Thank you, Cleta. And indeed, there's a lot of learning from, obviously, Egypt is also a large oil and gas producer. There, as you see the questions coming in, a lot of them are going to be about the process question. And Cleta's account indeed very much coincide with the version that I heard as well in terms of the holdouts, in terms of the text in the room last minute. Now, next, but certainly not least, again, Tiago, please take us through the nature-based solution to food systems question and climate justice as well. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Bernice. So from a land use perspective, also tackling issues of forest governance and climate justice, I would say COP27 was a COP of imbalances, disconnects, but also a COP where some bridges were potentially announced. In terms of disconnects, we have great clarity today that international markets and quote unquote international partnerships have been driving the climate crisis, deforestation, degradation, and particularly when it comes to commodity markets and large-scale land acquisitions. So one of the elements that wasn't really digested in this COP27 was on precisely the demand-side issues and issues related to overconsumption with a regular focus on supply side measures. In terms of disconnects, I would like to highlight two of them at least. One is, for example, to understand COP since Paris as a growing business fair, and where we talk about emerging markets, carbon markets, opportunities for tech, renewable energies. But on the other hand, there was a big representation of traditionally minoritized groups at COP27 this year. So representatives of indigenous groups, young people, women-led movements. And it's very clear that when you talk to them and they talk about their wants and needs connected to sustainable livelihoods, food sovereignty, these are not really on the high-level agenda, which would address elements of, again, overconsumption and international markets and partnerships not being balanced or equitable. And in terms of good announcements, we saw on the very second day of COP, the announcement of the Climate and Forest Partnership, which is voluntary in this case, led by the UK and others. And also a week later, we saw the announcement at G20 of a triple alliance led by Brazil, Indonesia, and Congo. And when I refer to a disconnect, is that the framings of this COP announced mechanism and the G20 one are not necessarily the same, and they're not necessarily coordinated. But in terms of potential bridges that I would highlight today, is for us to start connecting better with, I would say, G77, which showed great leadership at COP27, and also G20 and the high middle income countries, and try to reconcile those global level agreements with the ones that have been presented by emerging economies and the most marginalized communities.
Thank you. Do you want to talk about the food one, or maybe we can come back to that in the question later, the food systems piece as well? Lilia, do you want to come in on the climate finance, please?
Sure. So, yeah, the thing that has been the most talked about is definitely the specific fund for loss and damage that has been agreed upon and unexplained. But of course, there was the older fund, the Green Climate Fund, with the goal back from 2009 for parties to mobilize jointly 100 billion per year by 2020. That has not been met. So the COP decision expresses serious concern about this fund. But what I want to talk about the most is below Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, the text of the decision on the actual financial system. So Article 2 says that parties should work to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low emission and climate resilient development. But there has been no agreement so far between the parties on a clear definition of the term climate finance. So this is why when we talk about climate finance, we talk about these funds under the UNFCCC process, but we also talk about a transformation of the financial system. And this was the first at a COP text, this language around the transformation of the financial system. This was a huge trend in COP26. We had a wave of finance commitments, particularly the launch of the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with 130 trillion of assets under management. So this was like a big theme of COP26. And since then, like in the year between the two COPs, there were huge concerns around greenwashing and the integrity of pledges. So this was a huge topic. Also with central banking, climate-related central banking, the network for greening the financial system. So this was a big topic that personally, I didn't see as much discussion around it as I would have expected at the COP, apart from the Finance Day, that was the 9th of November. But actually, as I said, it was the first time that a COP decision had a big chunk of text about transforming the whole of the financial system, including the different kinds of financial institutions, regulators, central banks, involving also institutional investors, and mostly the multilateral development banks. So there is this call for the shareholders of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions to reform the system, their priorities and practices, align and scale up funding for climate. So they mentioned the role of guarantees, which is like a very specific instrument that has been discussed a lot lately. That the paper that I'm just about to publish at Chatham House, I also discussed the role of central banks and the guarantees and non-debt instruments. So it was really relevant to see these options, instruments into a COP decision, calling for the transformation of the financial system, its structure, processes, engaging all of the different classes of actors within the financial system. So yeah, this was the main point that I had here, but I also wanted to touch very quickly on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that is about emission reduction trading. So the rulebook of Article 6 was completed in COP26, but there were technical aspects remaining and still are under discussion, but mostly Articles 6.2 and 6.4 were discussed, and some of the technical aspects were agreed. Article 6.2 is about the so-called ITMAs, the internationally traded mitigation outcomes between countries. There are parties of the Paris Agreement, so they can buy and sell emission reduction certificates between each other, and these should be used towards their targets, emission reduction targets of their NDCs. So, and Article 6.4, on the other hand, can include transactions between non-parties. So this gets a bit more tricky. So the key decisions at COP27 included what kinds of information countries would need to report when trading ITMOs under 6.2, and the confidentiality of those transactions, the transparency, because there were issues around like allowing too much confidentiality. And the need for the so-called corresponding adjustment when there is this trade of emission reductions, so that there is no double counting. So that only one of the parties can actually use that emission reduction against their NDC targets. This is much more straightforward under Article 6.2 because it's trading between parties of the agreement, but when it gets to Article 6.4, it's a bit more tricky how to do that.
Great, thank you very much, Lydia. I'm sure for those who are interested, we can go back to it. Now we have our last speaker on the panel, and I just sort of use this to abuse it a little bit, that as we see a lot of the questions coming in, especially a lot of the existential questions coming in, which we're going to start getting everybody to come back to in a second. But before we do that, Karim, please kick us off in terms of agendas around city, how you see it, and how that will flip forward onto the UAE as well as a host for the next COP.
Sure. Thanks, Bernice. So I'll very briefly go through this. So progress has been quite slow in bringing actors like cities into the COP process. Historically, it was so much that out of touch that some of us are already calling for a restructuring of the COP governance system, calling for a multi-level climate governance model, and describing basically the COP format as not fit for purpose. And the reason this is the case is that because the cities are responsible for roughly 70% of emissions, yet cities are not party to the Framework Convention. They're not party to the UNFCCC. So they only participate in the COP as observers to the negotiations, and sometimes as some kind of lobbyists via side events, part of the fair, if you like. And climate action in cities has certainly been encouraged by the UNFCCC, both in terms of adaptation and mitigations, and that has increased since the UNFCCC launched the Marrakesh Partnership back in 2016. And certainly more than 1,000 cities have committed to impressive targets like carbon neutrality by 2050, very aggressive targets for 2030, but this remained parallel to and independent from the COP process. Last year, we saw some development. The Glasgow Pact, COP26, recognized the importance of cities. The pact included some appreciation of these increased actions, these commitments, and encouraged the participation of cities into the global stocktake, which ends next year, over the period of 2 years. At COP27, we saw less prioritization of cities in general because there were other more pressing issues, mostly to do with finance, adaptation, and loss and damage. But there were two positive developments that must be noted here. The first development was the launch of the SURGE initiative, which is short for Sustainable Urban Resilience for the Next Generation. It was launched by the presidency, by the COP27 presidency, and it aims to build on that Glasgow Climate Pact recognition and to integrate cities further into the process, into the COP process. And it does so by creating a media of coordination between parties, cities, city networks, and as well as UN agencies and NGOs. And it will focus on the normal city things, buildings, urban energy, waste, mobility, water, material consumption, etc. The second development was the reintroduction of the Climate and Urbanization Ministerial Meeting, which is something that has happened years ago in previous COPs, but now has been resuscitated due to pressure by ICLEI and others. And one expects that COP28 in Dubai will build on this and will accelerate this process. And there are a number of reasons, in my view, for this optimism that they will see an uptick in the role of cities. The SURGE initiative, the one that was launched this year, excuse me, acts as a catalyst for integrating city climate action by supporting this multi-level climate governance many of us are asking for and calling for. It can also help unlock urban climate finance because they've put in place mechanisms for doing so, and also for mechanisms for building local capacity. Because it has integrated the role of cities, which are already active, city networks, which are already active as observers into negotiations, networks like ICLEI and C40. The SURGE initiative could also enhance their role just by giving them legitimacy and further integrating them into the process. So that was something that will start next year. If we see the idea of having a ministerial meeting for urbanization and for climate being, as promoted, being an annual event, that could certainly grow. It was a moderate attendance at COP27. We'll expect that to be stronger attendance at COP28, simply because of the nature of this more significant COP. The global stocktake now has room for cities. The cities have been called upon to participate. So again, COP28 will see more participation of cities because they've been called upon. So if they have the capacity, they will participate. And last but not least is the role of the UAE itself and its own focus on climate solutions. Dubai itself, as a city emirate, also has a strong focus on solutions. It's a solution city and has always looked at climate action as a solution-led issue. So one expects this to lend itself to more discussions and more lobbying for city solutions, partly as a conduit to showcase urban climate solutions in Dubai itself, but in general to turn the page, if you like, away from the issues that have been discussed in COP26 and 27, more into what can be done now. And I think I'll leave you here, and I'm happy to take questions on that.
Thanks for that, for flipping forward in terms of what you think will happen in Dubai as well next year. I mean, look, I mean, you guys can see some of the questions, or maybe, I don't know whether you can, but I can, which a lot of them are sort of some of the more existential questions. What I plan to do is to do maybe one quick round of some of the existential questions, which I will summarize as, do COPs matter? Do they work in delivering solutions? Also, what are the performances of the major powers, which are obviously EU, US, China, among others, the big powers? These are some of the questions that I picked up. And last but certainly not least, does the host really, I mean, the impact of the host government on the process, and the process on the outcome? So these are some of the questions that I'm picking up from all of you, and I haven't named you. I hope that you know who you are, and that when I read out your questions already, which I would like to ask my colleagues to answer, which were, roughly speaking, COPs. Do they matter? Does it really deliver progress? The role of the host, performances of major power in terms of EU, US, etc., and whether we leave it there in terms of some of the more existential questions. And I will take a one round quickly, maybe like 1 minute each if possible, or maybe less. Not all of you have to come in, but maybe some of you should. So, and then what I would like to do is to flip onto some of the loss and damage question, because some of these existential question touches on loss and damage as well, right? In terms of, we have been promised money before, will this really deliver? Which will touch on that as well. So I wonder whether or not, I don't know, Glade, you want to kick us off with the sort of performance of the major power question and process question, given the mitigation agenda certainly has sort of stronger smell around, you know, the different influences over the outcome.
Yeah, I didn't sit in the deliberations, but I think I would say that the combination of COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine over the last few years, and the cost of living crisis, and all, you know, all the other crises, have really pulled countries out of doing serious behind the scenes diplomacy, you know, in a very strategic and measured way. Only a few countries have really engaged in that over the last few years, and that needs to be ongoing. It's not just about the COP. So it did seem there was quite a last minute rush, really, to get coalitions together to work on wording, which perhaps was due to these crises. I'll leave it to others to talk about specific performance. I think it's interesting that we now seem to be working through coalitions which shift from year to year, rather than thinking about ways forward that will work for everyone. But that seems to be the world we're in.
Sorry, I was just muting myself. So why don't you go next, Thiago, quickly, and then Anna, then you can pick up the performance question also, Anna, around the loss and damage as well, maybe. Thiago, performance of major powers.
Yeah, I think it's a potentially dangerous question when we think about performance of individual countries. I would assess the performance based on how much of solidarity they input in their negotiations and in the commitments they would make. And we've seen, for example, at COP26, where several of the least developed countries wanted to push for a strong commitment on reparations and climate justice, and that was pushed back by some of the major powers. And now again, in Egypt, we had another kind of selective pushing back on certain issues, some would say human rights, and then the matter of fossil fuels. Yeah, I wouldn't go for the assessing individual countries, but I do feel that the basic principle of solidarity has not been guiding international cooperation at COP.
Okay, thank you for that, Thiago. I think that if I could add quickly, I would say that this COP shows us that individual countries' performance matter, because they bring it back from home to bring back to the arena in many respects, national considerations. And I think this really shows us that it does matter. Some of the work has to be done at the in-country level if you're going to influence international processes. And I think it's pretty clear that from the host countries to others that it does seem to be the case that national agendas really matter. So Anna, why don't I come to you now on the question of loss and damage, and how you will see the performance question around the loss and damage as well, the process, and also some of the questions specifically you can see on the Q&A around loss and damage facility as well, in terms of whether it's going to work. Is it going to be new money? How is it going to work? Do the small island states gain? Pacific Islands. This is some of the questions that are coming up. Anna.
Yeah, thanks. There were a lot of questions about loss and damage. I don't think I'll be able to answer all of them because then I'll take up the rest of the the event. But I'll seek to answer a few of them. First, maybe about what kind of enabled the EU and others to shift their position. I think this is a really important question. My hunch is that there were a few different factors at play. There was very strong diplomacy from not least the small island states, but also the G77 and China. I think the co-facilitators, Germany and Chile, did an excellent job of trying to make countries find common ground. Also linking to the question of country performance, I think the EU did play an important role as a bridge builder on loss and damage, which is what they set out to do ahead of COP27. And this announcement on the Thursday evening was important and helped unblock some of the, helped unblock the stalemate that was surrounding these talks. New Zealand also came out earlier than the EU and said it would not oppose a fund, but it is a big and important question, and it's something I will myself be looking more into detail over the next few days, what enabled this quite remarkable shift in position. The second part of that question that came from that attendee was about, I think the question has now disappeared, but it was about delivering on promises made and the potential of this fund, I think, to actually play a role. It's a very good question. Obviously, developed countries pledged, in 2009 to deliver 100 billion per year in adaptation and mitigation finance, a promise that has not yet been fulfilled. And loss and damage finance is supposed to be new and additional to mitigation and adaptation finance. But there was a lot of talk about, innovative sources of financing at this COP. What that means in practice remains to be seen, but at least there appears to be some kind of willingness to explore this, and it's something that the process over the next few years will look at. Of course, it also ties to what I mentioned before about the discussions about broadening the donor base that could help scale up funding, and it might also make countries, there's those that are considered developed now, perhaps provide more funding. I think it would be important to learn about kind of the lessons from setting up other funds to make sure that this new fund is effective and responds to the needs. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the fund itself. There was also this call on other organizations to, like the development banks, to look at how they can support. And I think there will be a need for a package of solutions in order to effectively respond to the loss and damage challenge.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe this is also a good time to bring in the question. There's a question around the comments on the Bridgetown agenda, because obviously it ties in the whole question. The Mia Motley and the agenda seems to have picked up quite a lot of momentum. Macron is going to have a follow-up in June. Everyone is looking to the spring meeting. So I guess the question on everyone's mind is, how that relates, but also does it relate, and also how that will help deliver some of the non-delivery that we've seen so far among rich countries when it comes to finances. So whoever wants to comment, we can start with Lilia and others if you want to come in as well on the Bridgetown as well.
Sure, I could totally comment on that. Yeah, I think it definitely relates, and I think it relates even more strongly to what I was saying about the first time these texts about the more complex financial system comes into a COP decision. I don't think that the parties, the UNFCCC, saw much connection between these different parts of the puzzle before. I think this is a recent process, and I definitely think that the Bridgetown agenda and the recent speeches that Mia Motley has given have had a strong power and a strong influence on the COP process. When you ask, do COPs matter? I really think they do, because I think there are some things that emerge from the COPs that dictate what the conversation is from that point on. So, for example, 1.5 degrees, we didn't really discuss that, do research about that, model that before COP21, and then it became imperative also to the financial system. So nowadays we see the financial institutions trying to model what a 1.5 consistent pathway means for them as financial institutions. And so there has been this recent shift, and this is something that we also see at the World Bank, the IMF, and all the major institutions of the international economic architecture, as we call it. So the COP decision doesn't really mention the IMF, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that the IMF has recently launched, that is directly connected to the kind of loss and damage finance. It's not exactly mentioned in the COP decision, but I think it is implicit in the 3 or 4 paragraphs that they have put in there about the multilateral development system.
Thank you. I think the really good thing about the Bridgetown agenda here is the idea that UNFCCC this time around has text that is not quite like itself in some ways. It's not a decision text, but it's really more an orchestration text that in some sense, I think is a really good idea to think of this process being one of the drivers of other processes that is in play as well in this particular case of Bridgetown agenda. So I do think that there's a slight adjustment in terms of the role in terms of the UNFCCC on this, which is that it's just a sort of decisive move into a slightly different area of text that just, as I said, more orchestration, more like a sort of G8, G20 type text rather than the decision kind of text, which we saw today. So I think that with that, I think that I want to also collect more questions as well from the audience, which many of them are coming fast and furious. And I saw that Sam Baker is trying to usurp our process and do a poll on the side. And so I was thinking that if you want to participate, you're very welcome to do so. I think he's challenging one of the participants to put those who think that the COP delivers to put number 10 in the response, and if you don't think it delivers, put number 1 on the response. But I mean, bearing in mind this is a relatively limited kind of sampling in the context of the wonderful almost 300 people that are online right now and stay with us still. Now, so do feel free to do so if you feel like it. Now, there's a question about nature-based solutions and the question around forests and also food and agriculture and comments on that I want Tiago to pick up on, or others as well, and later perhaps if you like. And there's also a question which relates to the COP effectiveness question, which is that if it isn't effective, what do you see as the role of, if indeed the solidarity agenda doesn't deliver, what is the role of litigation and arbitration, which is increasingly a route that different countries and different folks are taking on as well. So I don't know whether any of the colleagues want to pick up on those questions as well. So why don't we start with the nature-based solutions agriculture and the food and agriculture agenda, and then we flip onto sort of the litigation and arbitration as well, in a way to sort of sharpen some of the sharper end of the toolkit question. Tiago, please.
In terms of the food and land and nature-based solutions, well, we have a first. Nature-based solutions is there under the forest heading. That's not great, I'd say, from a current perspective for cities, because NBS, of course, they can play a major role, not only into natural forests, but the analysis of our colleagues working primarily on food systems transformations is that there was a very narrow focus in the final text compared to the brilliant discussions that we had during COP in side events, taking more a system approach to food. Elements that have to do with food sovereignty, peasant family farming, food security, nutrition, and things that would go beyond the more financialized modes of agriculture, like in agroecology or more regenerative agriculture practices, weren't very much part of the final decision. When it comes to forests, I would say we had a good announcement during COP, which was sort of a round of updates on the COP26 pledges on forests, on the Congo Basin focus, and also on forest facilities tenure, which focus on land redistribution. And in terms of finance, what was sort of mapped and assessed is that the money is flowing at a decent rate. I'm referring then to COP26 pledges at Glasgow. So that we can see as a success. But again, I am back to the basic needs of the majority in the world. There's also back to the disconnects. we have money, we have more pledges for money. There's some disbursement levels happening across the board. But for the majority in the world, those financialized solutions would not fix the system or their needs, particularly those who are starving today, those who are living in areas of conflict. So the fact that we have disbursement doesn't mean that we are dealing with land use policy in a better way just because we have more money and just because certain companies say in the chemical industry or financial industry would be benefiting from those global trade flows.
Thank you for that. So basically the door is open for some of the food systems transformation pieces. This is the space to watch because the text is in there. Second, as we go into the implementation phase, which is about disbursement of the funding that is committed, as we know, delivering money onto the ground to people who really need it on the ground, which was outlined in Glasgow, will take time. And this is also very much a symptom of where we are today, which is that everyone talks about Egypt being an implementation COP. And implementation does mean something sometimes a bit less glamorous, which takes time to do, which is about letting the system work itself through delivery, some of the sort of pieces around it. Now, we have a couple of questions, as I said, around, again, the sort of usefulness or not. And there's a question which is really, I think that, we ask ourselves these questions all the time. Is it a distraction? Does it matter, etc.? And I know that there are no right answer to it, but there is an instrument, as I said, that has been highlighted in the question, which is increasingly being seen as an alternative, or at least an additional instrument, which is about litigation and arbitration. I wonder whether any of my colleagues want to comment on that. Grada, please.
Thanks. Just say a few words. Others will have their own opinions, but I'll just talk a little bit about what I think. I mean, what kept some countries from making stronger calls on the wording around emissions reduction and around fossil fuels is this concern about legal action, because you are seeing text from the IPCC, from the COPs appearing in court cases, and Canada in particular pointed out that this is a concern of theirs, that they would be dragged through the courts, or that there would be court cases, concerning this stronger wording on fossil fuels. There was a lot of pushback from civil society that you may or may not have seen in the press, including African civil society, over fossil fuels projects, and the idea that infrastructure would be locking them into a very dirty, unhealthy future, and that some of those have been taking those cases to the courts. The famous case of the Nigerian lawyer who took shelter court in The Hague is one of the recent ones, and that action seems to be growing. I'm going to post something in the chat, a link to a paper that Chatham House published last year on this growing use of human rights legislation in climate change cases. And I think some of the biggest changes will come from this. I think it's incredibly important. And the fact that, we have in the text, which I think stayed in the text, is the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, and the right to health. And it talks about the rights of Indigenous communities and women. The fact that that is there, and there are other UN pieces of agreements that back that up, is really fundamental to the legal cases that I think will make things happen. I do think that that's the more practical edge of driving through action towards 1.5, but also on adaptation issues too.
Thank you. Anyone else want to pick up on this question? And there's a question that I just saw that I really like that question, so I'm going to prioritize it, which is the question about the non-state actor. That obviously one of the achievements of this COP is indeed that a red line is now joined, what we put under greenwashing with the high-level exposure group and stuff. And then there's a question about what next, which I would love to comment on myself later. But before then, let's close the question around litigation and arbitration. Anyone else wants to comment on that? And if I may be so lost the word, deliberately obfuscating. Can I kind of roll this into a question that we have here for Karim, which is really about, you know, the next COP, you know, the central business of mitigation, but also the fact that the next COP will also be hosted by what the questioner called a petrol state, which is someone obviously with a strong oil and gas interest. So I sort of wonder whether I want to roll some of these questions together, which is the question of litigation, arbitration, and that obviously, as we talked about, host countries matters. And then after that, we'll come back to Anna as well on the sort of perspective of the loss and damage side as well in terms of litigation, arbitration, and the sort of evolution of that question. So Karim first, and then Anna.
Sure, it's quite an interesting one, because some argue now that this COP was about natural gas because Egypt is a natural gas exporter, and there was an element of pushback or deliberate lack of inclusion of wording regarding banning or phasing down all fossil fuels in the statement, but you can't use the same arguments you're using for natural gas as you would for a petrol producing country such as the UAE. The arguments for Africa, the energy transition, and the energy justice or the climate justice that was required for Africa, we can't use the same language in the context of maintaining the exportation while decarbonizing, which is basically the plan in the UAE, decarbonizing internally and exporting every molecule. And that's going to be a contradiction. I mean, of course, the accounting system allows it, and the UAE is not responsible for the emissions from the oil it sells, but we do expect the same level of pushback, although with less moral arguments than we are having than we had at COP27. I think we would see that done perhaps slightly better as well.
Well, thank you for that. Anna, want to come back in?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, to pick up on this litigation aspect from a loss and damage perspective. I mean, many have made the link that the lack of progress on loss and damage within the UNFCCC has really spurred this rise in litigation cases, and also the creation and launch of initiatives like Vanuatu having this campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ, and this commission established by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu last year. So there is that link there, and I guess it could be argued if there is a more firm and stronger response from the UNFCCC, that there may not be as much of a need perhaps for going to courts, but I guess that remains to be seen. My realistic assessment would perhaps be that we'll see the two tracks kind of developing at the same time, both the litigation aspect and then the response within the UNFCCC and broader financial system. I mean, it would of course be preferable for all, I think, if we were able to find a path that is more cooperative and where countries work together to find solutions and to support those suffering from loss and damage rather than suing each other in international courts. But that remains an open question. I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you for that. So, well, now we have about 5 minutes left, and you know, you all can see all the lots of questions that we've got, and I know I'm deliberately not asking them one by one because I thought that we can group them a little bit. So what I would like to do right now is to ask our panelists to sort of do a wrap up. But actually, when you wrap up, I would like to ask you guys to think a bit about and comment on what are the unfinished business that must be discussed further next COP, in order for us to genuinely see progress. You know, from the questions you see that there's a lot of existential questions about what is it all for, does it really work, does it matter, etc. But at the same time, what are your views on what must happen, or what are the unfinished business that must happen so that could genuinely bring progress? So, you know, obviously these could be everything from the role of emerging economies to, you know, obviously that's one of the questions, that they're not really on the spotlight in some ways, both on the mitigation as well as the payment into the loss and damage side. And there are many of these unanswered questions in some ways. So I sort of want to ask my colleagues to sort of comment on that as you wrap up as well, maybe 1 minute each. We'll start from the back. So why don't we start from Karim, and then we'll sort of go backwards. Then Lilia, then Thiago, then Gleda, then Anna. So Karim, why don't you do that first in terms of the wrap up?
Sure. I believe cities are where climate battles will be won or lost, and I think 84% of NDCs now recognize that to some extent. Many cities have been taking action, and that's great, but they're held back by governance, finance, and capacity issues. So if the role of cities is to be better recognized and encouraged, we need to see more than we have seen at COP26 and 27, as I pointed out earlier in my remarks. But in an ideal world, I would like to see a multi-level structure for climate governance that replaces the current architecture, which in my view is no longer fit for purpose. It was great for a while, but I don't think it's appropriate for the action-driven process that we're about to embark on.
Brilliant, thank you. Lydia.
Okay, so first I wanted to highlight something that I didn't before, that is the fact that the decision also highlights estimates of total investment needs and uses the upper bands of the existing calculations. So I think this is a very strong sign that we should think systemically, and that we should be thinking of the total finance needs, the total finance gap, and this requires system transformation. So this is something that we said on the IPCC Finance Chapter, Working Group 3, Chapter 15, but also the UN Emission Gap Report, Chapter 7. This is a point that we raised that I think was heard, and that is really important. So it talks about the trillions. We have been talking about the trillions since COP21 in 2015. But it is now like the 4 to 6 trillion needed per year is now written in a COP decision, and it of course entails the whole systems transformation that I said. So I just wanted to link this with what is needed. Then I'm talking about system transformation. So I tend to agree with Karen that we need more than the UNFCCC process. We need integration, we need multi-level international cooperation. Climate change is, quoting several colleagues, greatest market failure of all times, entails the need for the greatest capital reallocation since the Industrial Revolution. So no class of institution can solve it alone. So we need more integration between UNFCCC and the international financial system, governing bodies. And I think sorry, just finish very quickly. I think that the sign that the G20 sent by dialoguing with the COP at the same time this year was very important, and we need to see much more of that.
Sorry to rush you, just because I want 1 minute each. Tiago, please.
Yeah, very quickly. So one thing that should be done is to make a very clear connection, and for COP negotiators to understand that the climate crisis is part of the inequality crisis. And that said, we also need to better appreciate the views of a global majority across Latin America, Africa, and Asia.
Thanks for that, Gleda.
Thanks, Bernice. I think on the decarbonisation, it's very clear from the scientific reports of the IPCC and the IEA and UNEP that fuels, can't only be dealt with through decarbonisation technologies and through methane emissions technologies. We have to do that stuff very, very fast. But there's also the need for the path to phase out. But what's holding that back at the COP level is the current level of economic dependencies, fears of stranded investments, and really a failure of imagination. So I think what will be, the big question for the following years are the need to see what this kind of transition can mean for those countries, how it can be done, the practicalities of that. So with rich countries setting the example, but also packages like the just energy transition partnerships for South Africa and Indonesia actually working, and some early work on oil and gas dependent economies, which have been, there have been a fund announced for that at COP2. So that's a thing to watch, I think, given that those fuels have been entrenched in our system for about 150 years now. So it's not easy to get them out, but we need to make a start.
Thanks for that, for pointing the challenge around the supply side, definitely. And while others will talk about the demand side question as well. Anna, please, last word you have.
Thanks, I'll keep it short. I think a few key questions in the loss and damage space to look at going forward is how will this fund work and how will it be resourced? And I do think there is a need to think creatively around the sources of funding. Another one is what can other existing organizations do to better respond to loss and damage challenge? Already mentioned the multilateral development banks and the IMF, for instance. And maybe just in closing, I do think a lot of progress has been made. This is loss and damage is now on everybody's radar, and I do think there is a genuine willingness from all, essentially all parts to find solutions in this space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Obviously, I lied when I said Anna had the last word because I do. And I want to quick pick up on the question about the net zero for private sector is that the expectation now is that it's going to move into the regulatory space, whether through securities exchange and through other mechanism of disclosure, to asking companies to start talking about, say, on climate, is about what their plans are. So I think that that's the general expectation moving forward, which obviously would dovetail with a lot of the other ideas that my colleagues have serviced here. With that, I hope you all agree with me that we have had a very thoughtful reflection with the benefit of a few days, only a few days after the event. And your questions are really helping us think through some of the next set of questions that we need to ask ourselves, not just for Chatham House, but for the international community in general, as to the effectiveness of these processes and the importance of making sure that they deliver the outcomes that they promised as well. So with that in mind, this is a recorded version, so you can probably, it will be sent to you if you have signed up to it later on, if you know, that could be shared. Yes, it is on the record. And with that, I thank you all for all the great questions that you submitted. I hope that we tried the best to do them justice. At least it gives us a really good flavor in terms of what your needs and concerns are. And we will definitely try the best as we could, if not here, in the near future, to try and answer some of the questions that you have posted for us as well. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, and we welcome the fact that you spent the last hour with us, and many of you still staying with us, and thank you for that. Bye now. Have a good afternoon. Bye.